Hello and welcome to this discussion on the financial sustainability of English football, brought to you by LCP. I'm Alex Stewart, Head of Content at Analytics FC and formerly of TIFO Football and The Athletic. Earlier this year, Bart Hooby, LCP's Head of Football Analytics, told me about a project LCP's Covenant and Financial Analysis team were working on. The concept was simple: apply LCP's world-renowned expertise in pensions and assessing the ability of companies to support such schemes to men's football clubs. LCP therefore developed a method for analysing financial sustainability of clubs in the Premier League and the EFL. Football clubs are a lot like pensions, a combination of financial complexity and public equity, and Bart explained how this analogy would help LCP's team, led by John Parness England, dive into the murky waters of English football finance. I ended up collaborating on the project, and it was a fascinating process. Anyone working day to day in football knows that the situation for many clubs is precipitous. This was a starting principle for Tracy Crouch's fan-led review and the following government white paper, both of which are cited in LCP's report. I also believe that LCP's work would provide a strong basis for the future independent regulators' approach. John is going to take us through the report's work and introduce the sustainability matrix, which I believe is a key way to understand the state of play of English clubs. We've also just enjoyed a fantastic Women's World Cup, with England reaching the final, although controversy before and after Spain's win should remind everyone there is still a huge amount of work to do. Karen Carney's recent review of women's football in England therefore comes at a very welcome time, and LCP's response was thoughtful and brought a lot of the above work to bear. Ashley Mould, also from the Football Analytics team, is here to take us through that response. And finally, Bart Hooby will share LCP's recommendations and outline next suggested steps. So we're going to talk first to John Parness England. John, you've analysed the financials of 92 men's football clubs from the Premier League down to League Two. What were the biggest lessons?
I guess the first key learning was the scale of the losses in the industry. So, I guess that the fact the industry was loss making wasn't really surprising to us. But what was more surprising was the sheer scale of these losses on an aggregate basis, and also the number of individual clubs which are actually loss making. So out of the 92 clubs, over 60 were loss making, which is, quite a crazy statistic if you think about it. And not only were they loss making, the level of losses generated was far greater than we expected, in excess of £1 billion for just 1 year from those particular clubs. So that was, I guess, problem number one. So then you might ask yourself, how can an industry keep operating at such a loss? Well, this is where the owners come in. Losses need to be funded in some way. Most of these clubs will have, a rich owner simply pumping money in to cover each of these losses, a very common theme in the game for many, many years. So, we've mentioned the large scale losses and how many clubs continue to operate through cash injections effectively from wealthy individuals or companies sort of behind them. So, where is the problem? To me, it all comes back to the concept of sustainability. In my view, if a club cannot operate without an owner's cash, it really cannot be considered to be financially sustainable, particularly when that cash is covering operational losses in a sort of, business as usual scenario rather than being used for the future good of the club, whether it's building a stadium or a training ground or something of that nature. So in these cases, sort of what a loss-making club is really relying on to stay afloat is an owner who is both willing to continue to support it and critically able to continue to pump cash into the club on an ongoing basis. So if an owner gets bored, runs out of money, this is where a club can start to be at serious risk of financial problems unraveling.
So where in the pyramid do you see the most risk being?
Well, undoubtedly the championship was the most at-risk league. That was clear, and not really a surprise necessarily. It's a league where they're spending more in wages than they're receiving in revenue, which is a worrying reality to think about. And it's simply a product of these clubs gambling to reach the perceived riches of the Premier League. But a league which in itself is loss-making, which is another interesting story. But I think it's only if you really reach that, the big six, or maybe perhaps you'd argue the big seven now, where you really see that huge concentration of value, where sort of with nearly half of the overall industry revenue being generated by just those six clubs.
So, how would you summarize that issue in a couple of sentences?
Um, hard to summarize that in a couple of sentences, but I guess if I wanted to try and summarize the whole picture, I guess what you end up with is 92 football clubs, each, with so many different stakeholders reliant on it for both economic value but also social value, and that's, potentially millions of people impacted. And the fate of these clubs is ultimately in the hands of just a handful of, a small group of wealthy individuals. So something there doesn't seem quite right when you consider the potential impact, especially when you consider there's no real legal sort of mechanisms to protect a football club from going under if the support of an owner effectively stops overnight.
In the report, we talk about a kind of house of cards scenario. Can you just go into that further?
Yeah, so analyzing the industry, it was clear that the finances of different clubs are connected in so many different ways. We've talked about the reliance on external funding, typically from an owner, and often this funding will be used for example, Club X to pay Club Y money it owes for, often very large transfers. So, what happens if Club X is then unable to meet its financial commitments to other clubs? Well, Club Y won't get their money, and then maybe won't be able to pay the range of clubs it owes money to itself, and the domino effect potentially starts to go on and on and on. And we're not just talking about England here. Look at the situation in Barcelona just last year, where unable to register players, unable to pay transfer commitments, selling off future income streams to fund these obligations, all part of a very worrying trend, which is telling us, I think, the whole ecosystem across Europe has its problems, and it's not just concentrated in England. And there are some mechanisms and insurances that can be put in place to mitigate the risk in the short term. But when the issues are so widespread, the bigger issues typically will follow. And we're not I mean necessarily saying this is an imminent threat. It could happen in a year, could happen in 5 or 10 years. But what we're saying is there is an environment where this is certainly a plausible scenario, let's say.
So, you say it's a plausible scenario, if not an imminent one, but what are the kind of factors that could cause this to happen?
There are probably many factors, but let's just take one from the revenue side and one from the cost side. Let's start with revenue. I guess broadcasting revenue, one of the major streams of revenue, increasing in England at impressive rates for a long, long time. But there are no guarantees really that this trend is going to continue into the future. And I think every club is really betting on this trend continuing. If it slows or it stops, their ability to pay these future committed costs, which is really massive. You just look at Chelsea's long-term contracts as an example of huge, future commitments, say these costs could really start to be under pressure. So if the revenue growth is basically not matching or not following previous trends or what clubs are expecting, this is where sort of problems may start. And again, in some ways a linked issue, but the scale of money spent on wages in the industry is already out of hand. For clubs to remain competitive or keep their star player, it's simply going to cost more and more, as time passes, particularly as more cash is coming into the market. We're seeing that from Saudi Arabia clearly in the last window. So players are going to look at that, demand more cash, wages are going to be on the rise, and the industry, which is already massively overstretched, is going to have more pressure to increase those wages and add to the already existing problem. So I guess that's just two factors, either in isolation or combined, could really create an environment where clubs quickly run out of cash, overstretch themselves, fail to pay each other, and a house of cards collapse becomes a more realistic scenario.
John, last question. I wanted to ask about the LCP football sustainability matrix. Can you just explain what that concept is and why it sheds light on what's happening?
Yes, definitely. So when going through our analysis, we always had at the back of our minds that football clubs aren't, your typical corporate entity, and the definition of success will really vary depending on which stakeholder you ask. So, we've talked a lot about the financial issues in the game, but I think front and center to all of this is trying to manage one of the industry's key challenges, which is effectively balancing sporting success while still achieving financial sustainability, something which is not an easy feat. So, what we did was plot on a matrix both a financial score based on our methodology, and also a sporting success score, which tracks performance across various competitions from the previous year. So we talked a lot about the macro level problems, but what this analysis allows you to do is look at an individual club, your club or a club, and see how it compares to other clubs in the same league, both on financial and sporting merits. And the results were really interesting. One thing that really stood out to me was comparing Brighton and Leicester, two really interesting cases over the last decade. Brighton, lauded as a huge success in the press, and rightly so for many, many reasons. Their performance on the pitch, their ability to sell players for millions of pounds more than they bought them, and repeat the process several times. But sort of when talking about core financial sustainability, what we're actually talking about is independently being able to be financially sustainable, which means not reliant on that owner funding we discussed before. And over the years, Brighton has built up over £400 million of debt to their owner, Tony Bloom. And this is one of the reasons on our methodology they actually score pretty poorly. So as a club, it is pretty reliant effectively on the willingness and the ability for its owner to support that club. So that is a really interesting case. But, there's no signals that this won't continue. So unlikely that this risk will actually crystallize for Brighton itself. But, what if it did? What if Tony Bloom's core businesses start to suffer? He may need to take money out of the club. What if they are no longer able to sell on players for hundreds of millions of pounds to cover their costs? What if their performance on the pitch means they suffer relegation one season? Just look at Leicester, the last club to win the league outside the Big Six. They were very much in a similar boat, a hugely willing and able owner funding losses to try and bridge the gap to the top. And to be fair, they did reach the top for a season, but they had their star players. They were selling them on to support their finances. A very familiar theme with Brighton. But years of losses caught up with them. An owner eventually started to struggle to fund the club as much as it was before, particularly due to COVID-19. And we quickly saw a club who was unable to invest in the squad last year, ultimately resulting in relegation to the Championship, or at least contributing towards it, and sort of all the implications which then go with it. But there are some outliers. Plymouth Argyle's financial score was actually the best in the 2021-2022 season, and it was really fascinating to see them win the League One title last year, proving that you can be financially sustainable and still achieve success on the pitch. But sort of, I guess, on a overall looking at the micro level, you can really get under the skin of individual examples, and unfortunately you can really see clear correlations between clubs now facing financial difficulties. You look at Reading, Southend, and sort of many others, all with really familiar themes running through the clubs, which sort of shines through on our matrix.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for explaining all of that to us, John.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, really great to chat.
Now, going to go to Ashley Mould to talk a bit more about women's football. Ashley, thanks very much for joining us. The women's game has seen a lot more investment and exposure recently, but as Karen Carney makes clear, these opportunities do also bring pitfalls. Can you just take us through LCP's understanding of her work?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, thank you. I think it's first helpful to look at the context in which Karen Carney's review took place. So, towards the end of 2021, we had the fan led review of football governance released, and within that, there was a dedicated chapter that focused on women's football. That chapter recognised the different challenges faced by that side of the game, and I guess left the door open for a wider review of financial sustainability and governance in general within women's football. And whilst I entirely agree with that approach, it did mean that we were left waiting some time for that review to take place. And in the end, the release of that review coincided with the release of our first report looking into the financial sustainability on the men's side of the game in England. And as you'll be aware, Alex, there has been a history of underinvestment and unequal opportunity, which means that there are currently large disparities between the financial scale of the men's game in England and the women's game. Just for illustration, very broadly, men's football in England generates around 7 billion per year in revenue, whereas if you look at women's football in England, that's around the 50 million per year mark, so big disparities. Within Carney's review, I think that her and her team have done an excellent job at redefining the opportunity within women's football. As we stand now, some of the things you mentioned right at the start, which was we've come off the back of an England Euro 2022 victory. We've had more funding put towards equal opportunities in sport, and we've had a great World Cup that we've just been through. So interest and enthusiasm for the game is at an all-time high. To deliver the desired large rate of growth in football that is wanted, large investment will be needed, and Carney has publicly stated um, the goal of trying to get women's football to be a £1 billion industry within a decade. What the review does is balance the need for that investment with the need to develop in a sustainable way for continued long term success. The review also covers many other interesting and important aspects of women's football, including player health and safety, diversity, and also the importance of equal access to sport. However, what we see is that financial sustainability and independence, which perhaps we'll come on to later, is key to supporting the achievement of those objectives as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that briefly. What are the pros and cons of so many women's teams being financially involved with, even dependent on the men's club of that team?
We were already talking about large scale of investment in women's football being needed to deliver those growth targets that have been set. And women's teams being linked to a men's team that's able to fund some of that investment has got to be a bonus. And it's quite good to see that nowadays there has been real effort by some clubs in England to invest in the women's side of the club. I mean, for a long time, some teams were criticised for not doing that. And I think back to the example of Manchester United, who disbanded their women's team in 2005 and only set up a women's team again in 2018. So it's good to see that investment taking place. I think the issue is that whilst that investment has had a very positive impact on the professionalisation of the game in England, some of the points that John was talking about earlier mean that there are risks that come with being dependent on the revenue generated by the men's side of a football club for the ongoing financing of women's clubs. Um, and also, there's a secondary issue there, which is the approach to relying on that investment coming from men's clubs means that it favours those clubs where, on the men's side of the game, they have the most financial might. So the big six or big seven have invested heavily, and they will have an advantage if that source of investment continues. So that could lead to barriers for the game developing more organically, and it could potentially mean that the game isn't quite as equal across the football pyramid.
Yeah, it just seems to kind of potentially entrench the same sorts of inequalities that already exist in the men's game. Now, there has been a recent effort to upset that, with Lewis FC floating the idea of taking investment from a multi club ownership group, Mercury 13. Can you talk us a little bit through what's going on with that, and whether you think it's a smart way for the industry to go?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, that Mercury 13 development's a really interesting one for me. Personally, in particular, because I'm one of the fan owners of Lewis FC currently. I think thinking a bit more broadly, in terms of encouraging investment, I think a well run multi club ownership group might be better able to attract investment than a single club, particularly from investors who haven't previously been interested in investing in football. And part of that reason for me is because a multi club ownership group feels like a more traditional investment you might see with an investment fund that was outside of sport entirely, or certainly outside of football. And also, the use of a multi club group can lead to spreading of best practice and knowledge being much easier. Um, what I would say though is, whilst I think multi club ownership groups are a potentially good way to attract the investment we need, and certainly I do think they have a role to play, we need to be careful that the interests of those groups align with fans, players, and local communities so that they will be sustainable in the long run and people will still be pleased for them to own clubs. And we also need to be mindful that those multi club ownership groups don't impede fair competition across the game, so that fans' interest remains as high as it currently is.
MCOs are a great example because they have at once very successfully operated in the men's game and also created massive problems for certain clubs. What are the other areas that you think the women's game can learn from the men's game, either in terms of borrowing it because it's a successful model, or actively avoiding it because it's caused so many issues?
Yeah, sure. So I think Different organisations and individuals have been thinking very hard about financial sustainability in men's football for some time. And the reason why the focus has been on men's football is because, for one, the size of the industry. We also have a lot of data available, and there have been concerns about the types of issues that John's spoken about for some period of time. And individuals who are quite well known in that space, Christina Philippou, Kieran Maguire, very well respected individuals, and also we have DCMS who are building on Tracy Crouch's fan-led review to put effort into creating a regulator for English football, and their efforts have very much been focused on tackling on those problems we've seen in men's football. Whilst you need to be appreciative that women's football being in a much earlier stage of development is a very different issue to tackle, many of the same concepts that are being used and applied to financial sustainability on the men's side of the game can be applied to the women's side of the game. We spoke about over reliance on owner funding earlier. There can be over reliance on funding from men's football generated revenues or owners on the women's side of the game in the same way. That said, clearly many of the financial practices that we see in men's football are, or at least on the face of it, unsustainable, and create risks for the continued success of the game. And that's certainly something we want to avoid as the women's game grows in the longer term. So, thinking a bit more broadly, and perhaps to end this question on a slightly more positive note, so over recent years, use of technology, data, AI has grown significantly in men's football, and intelligent use of those things can improve decision making and make organisations or individuals more efficient. Examples of this are seen in extending the reach of recruitment teams into new regions that they previously couldn't reach. So something we do in collaboration with Analytics FC is offer a platform called Transfer Lab, which in 2021 became the first comprehensive data scouting platform for women's football and is now used by a number of top women's teams across Europe and in America to assist them in their scouting operations. Looking elsewhere, use of AI can make everyday tasks a lot quicker, so it could free up time for individuals to work in other spaces, and use of technology can do things like enable women's teams to organise friendly fixtures more efficiently against teams of a similar strength, which is something we've been involved in by helping to build the European Club Association's fixture hub. So these uses of technology can increase that pace of growth within the women's side of the game. So I really do hope that they're adopted widely. So in summary, I think financial sustainability concepts and technology, yes, by all means borrow those from the men's side of the game. Some of the financial practices we see and spoke about earlier, definitely not.
And in terms of the legacy of the World Cup that we've all just watched and enjoyed, what do you think that can be in a positive sense and potentially in a negative one?
Yeah, so I mean, I loved tuning into the World Cup as I always do, and it was only the long travel distance that stopped me from attending games. And as an England fan, it was great to see us almost get right to the end of the tournament. Um, on a more serious note, I particularly feel for Spain's players and fans who had their celebrations very much overshadowed by the actions of the president of the Football Federation in Spain during the trophy lifting ceremony, and then also how key organisations have handled the events in the wake of that happening. Um, this, of course, had followed protests towards the end of last year, where the Spanish national team were demanding changes in the national team setup and also weren't happy with their coaching team. Now, personally, I think the actions of the president were entirely inappropriate, and the handling of the issue by the Spanish authorities could have been far, far better. And perhaps that highlights the important question around who should be governing women's football going forward. And perhaps in some cases, the governing organisations that have popped up around men's football in the past aren't necessarily the best governing bodies to take forward women's football in the future. That said, to end on a positive note, we've seen a record-breaking World Cup, both in terms of attendances and coverage worldwide. It's further raised interest in women's football and has given a further demonstration of the potential for growth in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Alex.
So now we're going to go to Bart Hooby. And Bart, there's clearly a lot going on in men's and women's football, albeit in very different ways, very different stages of development. Pulling all of this together, then, what are your and LCP's recommendations for creating a sustainable future for football?
Okay, well, as you say, Alex, very different issues facing the men's and women's games, but ultimately, financial sustainability will be key to clubs in both versions of the game, giving their fans and communities what they actually need. So looking first at the men's game, I think the picture is relatively straightforward, in fact. As John's already described, there are many financial issues affecting clubs across the pyramid, with these being most extreme in the Championship. These problems are laid bare in our report, but I think they're already quite widely recognised in principle, and the government now has an opportunity to give the new regulator a framework and powers to help put the game on a much more sustainable footing before the kind of potential house of cards collapse discussed earlier by John happens. That there really is an opportunity to get things sorted. So our three main recommendations build, in fact, on what's in the recent government white paper. And we believe that if these are carefully and thoughtfully implemented, they would genuinely make a big difference. So our first recommendation on transparency and consistency is very much in line with what's in the white paper. And this is that all clubs should be required to publish basic financial and governance information in a timely manner and in a standardised format. And this information should go to their fans as well as to shareholders and to the new regulator. This will give a more comprehensive and consistent analysis of both club-specific and systemic risk, and will give fans a much better understanding of how their club is being run and what risks they're exposed to. Our second recommendation on what we call holistic risk assessment takes the white paper proposals a bit further. We believe that, given its cultural significance and its importance to local communities across the country, the football industry should be held to a higher standard than a typical corporate entity. To properly understand the level of financial risk for a club, its finances need to be considered holistically alongside the position of the club's owners. This is in terms, as John said, both their willingness and their ability to provide funding to cover the sort of ongoing losses that many clubs incur, and also their future financial obligations, for example, outstanding transfer fees and player contracts. We believe that such an assessment should be carried out at any time a club is acquired by a new owner and be part of the normal owners and directors test. And it should also be updated on a regular basis, perhaps every 3 years. And where such an ongoing assessment indicates a significant risk of failure, the owners should be required to submit a recovery plan to the regulator to put the club's finances back onto a sustainable basis. And our third recommendation actually goes quite a lot further than what's in the white paper. And this recommendation is to financially incentivize and reward what we're calling good behaviour. And evidence shows this can be a powerful tool in encouraging organisations to improve the way they operate. Now, within football, this could readily be done by linking part of the distribution of broadcasting revenues to how each club performs in various key areas. These would include, for example, financial performance, good governance, fan and community engagement, diversity, inclusion, and environmental sustainability. So things that really mean the clubs run well, but also behaving in the way that we want all good organisations to operate. Now, the Fair Game campaign group of more than 30 clubs have already published an approach based on what they're calling a Fair Game Index, where they measure how clubs are doing in many of these areas. The first iteration of this was published in July this year, and we believe this could form a broad model for developing such a system in practice. So that's our sort of 3 steps to heaven for men's football in this country, or at least 3 steps to a financially sustainable future.
Okay, Bart, so you fixed men's football. What's with the women's game there then? What are your recommendations?
Well, that is a much more difficult and complex question, I think. As Ashley has already discussed, the women's game is at a much earlier stage of development than the men's and has the potential to go in many different directions. I think the big risk is that it simply follows the way in which the men's game has gone in England, with the same big 6 or 7 clubs dominating the game at the top of the WSL, and the same kind of financial sustainability issues resulting from clubs needing to overspend just to keep up with those clubs. I do hope the women's game is strong and bold enough to follow its own path and do things differently to avoid most of the problems now facing the men's game. I just go off on a slight tangent from looking only at financial sustainability. And one way in which I think the women's game could benefit from doing things differently would be to look at the rules of the game. I know various people, including Emma Hayes, have suggested that the goalposts in women's football should be a bit smaller, say 10% smaller, to reflect the average height of women being broadly that amount less than men. And I think this kind of thing should be considered further. And another area, which is a bit of a bugbear of mine, is heading. It's already known that regular heading of a football results in micro concussions to players that can build up and have now resulted in significantly higher levels of dementia in older age amongst former male professional footballers. But there's also significant amounts of academic research now that indicates these micro concussions can affect women's brains more seriously than men's, though the reasons for this are not fully understood as yet. Within LCP, we've recently been doing research on the amount of heading that takes place in both men's and women's football. And the good news is that there's significantly less in the women's game at the moment. But that said, our evidence shows that some women players do still head the ball a lot and are therefore significantly risking their brain health in later life. So could the women's game set an example to the men's by either eliminating heading altogether or, for example, altering the rules to reduce significantly the number of meaningless midfield headers while keeping those which take place perhaps around the penalty area that are part of the real spectacle of the game? I know FIFA wouldn't like the idea of different rules for men's and women's games, but then maybe FIFA isn't necessarily the best judge of what is best for women's football based on some of its recent experiences. Coming back to financial sustainability issues, I'd say the current big challenge for women's football in England is to find a way to develop a competitive environment which isn't simply dominated by teams associated with the big men's clubs, as currently it seems to be developing. This doesn't have to be the case, and if we look at what's happening in the US, for example, we can see that the NWSL is developing apace, with most of its teams now unconnected to a men's team and standing very much on their own financially. Ashley mentioned the Mercury 13 investment proposal with Lewis FC, and that looks like a great attempt to build something similar over here, based on the amazing work that club has been doing for many years, including positioning itself as the first gender equal club in the world. It certainly won't be an easy balancing act to get this new investment right for the club's community of owners, alongside the parallel need to ensure this is an attractive proposition for the Mercury 13 investors. But I think it will be hugely encouraging if they can do it, as it should help them compete on a much more of a level playing field along with the likes of Chelsea, Arsenal and the Manchester clubs. More generally though, I'd actually say that the principles behind our three main recommendations for the men's game do equally apply to supporting the positive development of the women's game. Transparency and consistency of financial reporting certainly needs improving, including at many of the established women's teams, where the level and sustainability of the cross-subsidy from the associated men's team is often unclear. And similarly, looking holistically at the position of the women's team and its owners will be important when assessing the financial sustainability of the whole setup. And finally, incentivising and rewarding good practice within women's clubs will, we think, be just as powerful a stimulus to positive developments there as in the men's game.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Bart. And indeed, thank you, John Parnis England and Ashley Mould, for joining us earlier. You can find all of LCP's work on financial sustainability within football via the LCP website. There's lots of interesting information there about what LCP are also doing in the football analytics space. And you can reach out and connect directly with Bart or Ashley or John via LinkedIn and probably some other social channels as well. So thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on financial sustainability in football, and we will see you again soon.